The first thing I want to say is that the good Dr. Grunder and I did not compare notes. So I want you to note that we developed almost exactly the same talk without talking to each other, and that's called convergent validity. It suggests that we might not be crazy, that we might actually be saying something that's possibly true about antidepressants, and I wanted to talk about that today because that's what really sets the stage for what we are doing at Usona. Of course, I also want to address with you what Usona is, so let's start with that. In a nutshell, Usona is a pharmaceutical company that's also a charity. And putting those two words together should blow your mind. The longer that I've been involved in this work, the more it's blown my mind. In fact, I think in some ways that's more radical than bringing psilocybin to market, because it suggests a very novel way of how we might sort of explore ways of bringing especially challenging treatments. And psilocybin is pragmatically challenging from a commercial perspective for some reasons, how we might be able to bring them to a market. So we are a nonprofit. We're a medical research organization, which is a specific type of organization in the United States. We were founded in 1914, and we are actively engaged in medical research. So we have a mandate to serve the public good in the sphere of healthcare. So there's all sorts of things one could do to do that. What have we chosen to do to be optimally effective? And the answer is that based on what Matt just talked about, we've zeroed in on depression. And there are a lot of reasons to zero in on depression. It is a huge mental health problem in the modern world, and I don't have the slide that Gerd showed showing that rates of mental disorders and depression and stress are generally increasing in the modern world. The modern world is very good for the things that the modern world does. It's probably not so good for us as evolved human beings, and we're beginning to see that wear and tear. It is either the first or the second largest cause of medical morbidity in the world. It will become the largest cause. Many studies suggest that people that really struggle with chronic depression lose 8, 9, 10 years of life, not from suicide, or not just from suicide, but just from the fact that depression is not just a brain disorder, it's not just a mind disorder, it is a whole person problem, and that eats at the heart and it eats at the vasculature. So it's a medical problem also. It's a huge economic burden. But I don't need to tell people in this room that depression is also just a terrible condition. Unlike other medical conditions, which you can sort of sometimes separate yourself from, depression has this odd characteristic of not just existing inside the person, but changing how the entire world looks. And I know just from the demographics that many people in this room have been depressed, so you know what I'm talking about. It is an earthly hell when you're really in the middle of it. And part of the reason it makes this such a damnable condition is that the treatments we have are not adequate. Now, I didn't pull this number out of the air. It's sort of a rough percent, but I want to shift now to the fact that part of the huge challenge of this very painful disorder is that the treatments we have, while not without merit, are inadequate. And the study that took us from the world of listening to Prozac, which is a beautiful book and has many truths in it, to the world we live in today in many ways, was this huge study done in the United States called the STAR-D trial. And the idea was we're going to take people in a regular, real-world doctor's office setting, not the squeaky clean people that get into pharma trials, but like real drinking, maybe a little bit of drug and kind of medically ill, just regular folks with depression, and we're going to treat the hell out of them with an SSRI, high dose, 12 weeks, and then we're going to take everybody who doesn't respond and we're going to try a second kind of treatment, and then we're going to try a third kind of treatment, then we're going to try a fourth kind of treatment, and we need 4,000 people because so many people are going to respond to that first treatment that we need a lot of people. Well, there was a shock when in fact, despite kind of optimal treatment with this SSRI, only a third of people got well. Only a third of people went into remission, and the other 2/3 remained on some spectrum of symptomatology, so being symptomatic. Problem being that even if you're a little bit symptomatic, your odds of relapsing and getting sick again skyrocket. And in fact, even in the people that went into remission in this study, most of them had relapsed within a year. So this was a shock of disillusionment to folks like yours truly, who were big believers in those years, card-carrying believers, that these agents were the future of mental well-being, that everybody should take an antidepressant. In the 90s, I used to say, we should all be taking antidepressants. They're like brain food, That was really the perspective we had. These data and a lot of subsequent data shattered that. Now, if you take pharmaceutical trials and you look at antidepressants, people say they don't really work very well. This is a huge data set. This is the slide that Gerd showed. I'm going to show it slightly differently from John Crystal's group. 3-4 points difference between the red and the green. That's sort of minimal, that's minimally important therapeutic change. But all of us who work as clinicians know that that can't be the full story. And what was brilliant about what these guys did in these 5,000 or so people is they used a type of statistical methodology called latent growth curve modeling, where they looked not just at the averages in the group that got placebo and depression, but they looked at individual trajectories. And when they did that, they found what Gerd showed, which is that about 75% of people who take antidepressants do a lot better than those on placebo, right? But that unlike placebo, which represents sort of a unified group, most people who take placebo generally do better. Some do a lot better, some do a little better. What emerged that is frightening is that blue line, because those are people that are having a rough time, and almost all of them are on active antidepressant. Agents that have biological effects for the good always have biological effects for the bad. But we had underestimated this really large contingent of people that would be so much better off if we just gave them a sugar pill. So when I talk to doctors, which I do a lot, I say, I think the take home of this is when you start somebody on an antidepressant, if they're not looking better in a couple of weeks, you're probably harming them. And the reason you don't know it is because you never give people a placebo. So this very, very bracing data. So there's a lot of bad news for when antidepressants don't work. And the first one is that if you are not one of those lucky people who comes into the doctor's office and gets a prescription for Prozac or Zoloft, one of the SSRIs, you take it, and 4 weeks later you go, oh my God, doctor, you're a miracle worker. I feel so much better. If you are not one of those people, you are very likely somebody who is not going to benefit from currently available antidepressants. What the graph shows is in a very, very large population of people that are now, many years, these are mostly middle-aged people. If you look at what predicts not responding to the treatment they're currently getting, one of the biggest predictors is failing to respond years ago to their first dose. And so we now know that if you fail one antidepressant, you begin a steep slide towards not responding to anything. You fail two, it goes like this. That's really what that STAR-D study showed. 33% of people had a remission to the first antidepressant. The people that required 4 treatments, 13% had a remission, which means what? 87% did not. And more disturbingly, the more treatments that people required, not only were they less likely to get a benefit, but if they did get a benefit, the time that it lasted shrunk. So that by the time these people had circled through 4 treatments, they only remained well, if they got well, for 2 months, 2.5 months. So the take-home point here is that for a huge percentage of people that are really struggling with depression, the current treatments don't cut the mustard. They're not fully adequate. What has occupied a lot of my thinking and caused me significant psychic distress over the last 5 or 6 years is this growing realization that far from being brain food or fertilizer for the brain, antidepressants, and this is the bottom line, may actually weaken the brain over time. And this is what Gerd was talking about you say this and you're going to get kicked out of maybe the old boys club. But the data are sort of converging and distressing. And there's 2 ideas people have talked about. One is this idea of tardive dysphoria, which is that there is evidence that when you take an antidepressant for a considerable period, at least some people begin to lose the effect of the antidepressant, require higher doses. And what that suggests is that the antidepressant, because it's constantly pushing on the brain, induces changes in the brain that begin to push back. That's this thing called oppositional tolerance. Think about an opiate, right? In general, any medicine that activates and constantly is pushing on postsynaptic receptors induces compensatory sort of reactive changes in the other direction, right? And when you withdraw the medicine, the brain whoosh, this way, and you get a big reaction. So with benzodiazepines like Valium, you take them away, the brain blows up, you get seizures. With opiates, you get this massive sort of pain explosion. And we now know that especially SSRIs, and some more than others, but in general, that antidepressants induce a withdrawal syndrome, and that withdrawal syndrome is associated with relapse. So this, I think, is the 10,000-foot view that we as a field have developed a pharmacology sort of paradigm that sees depression as this often chronic condition that requires chronic treatment. 10, 15 years ago, I was always saying, you know, if you had a couple of episodes of depression, you just need to stay on an antidepressant for the rest of your life. And now I find myself in 2019 kind of eating my words and saying, I don't know what to say anymore. Hate to have you depressed, so if that's what it takes, you know, I guess you should do that. But is it optimal? No, right? So this fact that many people who actually have a listening to Prozac response to antidepressants find that over time they cannot live without them suggests that they're in some ways, they're sort of a devil's bargain in ways that we really did not understand when we began this journey as a way of treating depression. So, what's the solution? Well, I want to suggest to you that the solution is that we really need a new paradigm. But you know, for humans to have a new paradigm, you usually need a new tool, right? You can't have a world of internet until you have an internet. We can't have a paradigm shift in mental health treatment unless we have a tool that engenders that paradigm shift. And I think it's increasingly clear, though, what the paradigm shift is going to need to be, and I've kind of alluded to it. So if we've had a paradigm where we constantly are stimulating the brain with these chronic treatments, what we need to shift to is a paradigm that's more like weightlifting. I always like this as an example, right? So you think about weightlifting. If you spent 24 hours a day, 7 days a week lifting weights, you'd fall apart, right? Your muscles would tear up, you'd be a mess. But if you lift weights for a limited period of time and then let recovery happen, you actually build strength, you build resilience. And there are now several treatments in the world of depression that look like weightlifting, by which I mean you're exposed to the treatment, it does something biologically, but then the treatment goes away. The stimulus is gone, but something is set in motion. There is a compensatory response of the brain-body complex that produces a behavior change. And instead of it being a weakening behavior change, it looks like a resiliency building change that is now sustained by the brain-body complex itself and not dependent on the constant infusion of an exogenous external substance, right? So one of the studies we've done is, it's so interesting, Gerd showed the cold bath. We and a couple other people have shown that you can treat depressed people with hyperthermia. You kind of cook them up. And if you do that once, people feel undepressed for 5-6 weeks. We talked about ketamine, although it doesn't have the extended response that something like psilocybin does. You know, you get at least a week or two. There's a new compound called brexanolone, for reasons we don't understand. In postpartum depression, you get this one treatment, and then, how am I doing? Beautiful. You get this one treatment, and then 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks later, people are still feeling better. So it's not just psychedelics. There is a movement afoot in mental health that's hugely exciting that has this paradigm shift. Time-limited treatment, setting up self-sustaining resiliency patterns in the brain-body complex of depressed people. But of all the treatments that are floating around, clearly the reason I have such a passion for psychedelics is because they seem to have the strongest signal in this regard. And so now we've all seen these data multiple times. But you know, what's striking about them, and Matt said this, is that you know, people get one treatment or two treatments, and then months later, many of them are in a sustained different space. And that, I want to suggest to you, is the core nugget. That is the paradigm shift. And psychedelics are a key tool for inducing that paradigm shift in psychiatry. So, That's where all the glory stops. That's where all the cool science stops. That's where fame and glory and now we get down to the nuts and bolts pragmatics of, okay, so now what? And so the now what, of course, is that if there's value, if there's truth in what I've been saying, it would be hugely important if this could be translated into a sphere where the rank and file folks of the world could access psychedelic treatment for depression. Now, there are a number of challenges. The first, of course, is that there is a giant world of treatments that look like miracle cures in small studies that fail when they have to run the gauntlet of an FDA or an EMA type study, because these are very different types of studies, and it's a thing called the winner's curse, in fact, that is huge findings in an early study, millions and millions and millions of dollars, big study, failure. So it is not the case that the type of studies that are needed for FDA approval are just an afterthought or proving what we already know. I actually do not believe that at all. If it turns out psychedelics do not work for depression, I will be bummed out. I will not be hugely surprised, because a lot of things don't work, and they may still be hugely valuable for other things. So the first thing that Usona is doing and is committing to this arduous, dull, detail-ridden, grinding work of pursuing the types of studies that, if they are positive, would support an FDA approval in the United States for psilocybin for major depressive disorder, for the reasons we've talked to. So what does this mean pragmatically? What are we doing? Well, we have produced pharmaceutical-grade psilocybin, which turns out not to be such an easy thing to do. It's expensive, it's difficult, but it's been done. We are launching this fall, as I mentioned yesterday, an 80-person phase 2 study that has all the characteristics needed for those data to be given to the FDA, and if they're positive, they support a new drug indication. It's only the first of several studies that would have to be done. We have 7 sites, and we are very honored that many of these sites are really the ancestor sort of parents of the field, like NYU and Hopkins, Yale, UCSF, UW-Madison, and 2 very, very cool clinical trial sites that specialize in studies of depression. We have a guide manual completed. This is part of a larger active work we're doing in trying to engage with the field as a whole around what best practices might be for these agents and how those practices might be scaled. That turns out to be a huge challenge. And then we have a website. We got 5,000 names on the website. The demand for these agents is so powerful. It's heartbreaking. Every week I get emails or phone messages from people literally sobbing on the phone, begging that this is their last chance. And again, that's especially difficult because these trials take a long time. We don't yet know for sure whether it works. And most people that struggle with depression don't get into these trials because they have comorbid conditions. Here is if those are the sort of down in the weeds details of what we're doing, this is the 10,000-foot view. So being a nonprofit opens up fascinating opportunities for developing this compound, because if your only guiding principle is how do you maximize the public good, it makes you remarkably creative in thinking about how can we find a way to make a medicine available that may be a single treatment or only a couple of treatments, so very hard to monetize without it costing a great deal of money. How can we make this available to the widest group of people? How can we get it into places where it's not part of the culture? In America, how can we get it down into the Deep South? How can we work to overcome some of the cultural stigma? These are all things that we're free to think about in these really novel ways, because at the end of the day, our only metric for success is whether or not we optimized the public good in the domain of healthcare. For a guy like me who spent his life trying to be a famous academic and not really succeeding, it's been this personal journey of exactly what people were talking about yesterday and what Thomas Metzinger was talking about considering what happens when you're free to take on the public good as your prime objective. We have, as a result of that perspective, an open science policy, which means that unlike when there's an intellectual property or some kind of situation where you want to hold on to things because there's a monetary incentive, we don't have that incentive. So we're able to practice a remarkable brand of open science. As part of that, we are actually able to offer our material to researchers free. Because we can. And because that then fosters collaboration in the field and helps reduce competition and makes it available for the widest group of sort of people that can advance this line of work. And we also see ourselves as a convener of experts where we want to be involved. We are in fact involved with people all around the world trying to explore ways, how can we all together accomplish this mandate so that if psilocybin turns out to have a clear signal in the type of studies that will get it through the gauntlet of regulatory approval, if that happens, how can we optimize how this agent can be used to help people? And, you know, when you think about where you spend your time in the world, one of the things that's so exciting about this work is that this quote says it all. You know, we only have so much time in life. We only have so much energy. So if you can focus it on a place where you're at a fulcrum that you push and a lot of things change, this is one of the places in the world where we can do that. So this is the World Happiness Report, which says that the single most powerful impact on improving global well-being would come from the elimination of depression and anxiety disorders, which are the main form of mental illness, more than these other domains. Not that these other domains aren't huge, because they all drive depression and anxiety. But the point being, and this is very much what Thomas Metzinger said yesterday, the internal state within which each of us lives and views the world is really what drives who we are and how we feel and how we behave. Finding ways to optimize that, not to create states where people are dependent every day on a medication, not to create states where they are flatly and dully happy, but to create states where people are alive and can suffer and can feel and can live without crashing into the sort of hopelessness that happens in depression. Trying to chase that down is one of the highest things that we as human beings can do. And so I want to thank you all for your attention and thank you for being involved in this work. And that's all I had to say. So thank you.
Thank you very much for this talk and for your work in this field. My question is regarding the substance you focus on. So as far as I understand, psilocybin is a prodrug for psilocin, which is probably the active compound.
Yes.
Have you thought of looking into other prodrug forms like acetoxypsilocin or something, which, I mean, I don't know the regulations in the US, but on the European market, this could be a thing.
Yes, we have thought about it. Yes, we have thought about that, and yes, we are actively examining other psychedelic compounds for their potential relevance or efficacy. The reason we haven't pursued it is because there's more. The reason we haven't pursued it is because there's so much more data with psilocybin, because psilocybin works well, and because we don't have a need for something that could be patented or something that could be. There's a lot of discussion about the potential, commercial value of other prodrugs that would produce psilocin. But since psilocybin is readily available, since we have a lot of information about it, and because our goal here is really to try to bring a psychedelic to the market, we're not actively pursuing it, but there are people that are very interested in it.
Thank you very much for the talk. I have a question toward the paradigm shift that you are mentioning, psychiatry to building up resilience. And I wonder where you see psychotherapy there. But isn't that what psychotherapy is doing or trying for decades already?
Absolutely. So the question is, where do I see psychotherapy? And the answer is that psychotherapy is a resilience builder. And I just didn't have time, but there's beautiful data showing that, when you stop an antidepressant, people crash and burn. They crash into depression. When you stop psychotherapy, not every study sees this, but it's pretty clear that if down is bad, you stop an antidepressant, you crash. Psychotherapy actually has protective effects. So do certain types of meditation, like MBCT, that are combined with psychotherapy. And psychotherapy shares with psychedelics an interesting sort of pattern, which is, they often say that psychedelics, when they work, are like a year of psychotherapy in a day, that you get these sort of sudden saltations or a leap up. So if there's a huge psychotherapy literature showing that if you look at people in psychotherapy, they don't gradually improve like this. Much of their improvement also comes in these sort of sudden gains of insight, right? So in fact, I think that it's not so surprising that the data that Matt and others have shown repeatedly, that the quality or the realization that occurs during the acute psychedelic experience predicts longer-term outcome, because you see exactly the same thing in psychotherapy. So absolutely, the challenge of psychotherapy in the United States is that it's not widely available, and many, many people with depression cannot access it. So that in my world at least, most people that are struggling with depression get put on a medication. And so, but absolutely, psychotherapy falls on the side of a treatment that's resiliency building, that has that same capacity to produce benefit once it's stopped. Good question.